Mark, it is an absolute pleasure to be with you, sort of, visually, virtually, digitally. But it is wonderful to be with you. You know, when Father Mark sort of sent me the email saying, "Oh, would you mind?" I was delighted to be able to accept, although utterly nerve-wracked to be sort of offering a talk to a group of people that I've never met, from places that, well, I've probably been to a handful. So it's an absolute honour to be able to sort of participate in this Lenten series. Seeing the list of speakers, I'm sure it's been said before, it's an honour and a terrifying honour to be a part of this group. But I also want to just quickly acknowledge that I don't know. I know some of the headings. You know, I went onto the Facebook sort of page over the last couple of weeks and saw what others were talking about, and there is a wide range of subjects, wide range of topics that are being covered. But if there is any overlap, not always a bad thing to repeat, but if there is any overlap or underlap or side lap or any other kind of lap, then I apologise for that now. But I'm just going to take the opportunity to talk to you about stuff that's on my mind, if that's quite all right with you. And if it's not, I'm afraid you're captured. You know, you're completely captive for the next half an hour, 45 minutes or so. And it's going to be recorded for posterity, so you can even watch your captivity back, sort of in due course. So I'm just going to offer some things that hopefully will stir a thought, hopefully will stir something in you. I'm always conscious that whenever I speak to a group, either in person or virtually, that there is a ridiculous amount of wisdom in the room, much more so than I will ever possess or am capable of possessing. So in what I say to you this evening, in what I say to you, well, if you're watching this in the future, whenever it is you're watching it, I just want you to know that your thoughts are as important, if not more important to me than I would imagine mine are to you. The wisdom that you possess is important, and you need to engage with this with that knowledge that what you have to say on these matters is utterly essential. Because what I'm going to be talking about effectively tonight is, well, a brief look back at the pandemic, but what comes afterwards. This is what's filling my head at the moment. What comes after the pandemic? You know, the government's published their roadmap. And I suppose the question that I'm really asking is, what is your roadmap? What is our roadmap as a parish? What is our roadmap as a diocese? You know, what do we do after this pandemic comes to an end? Now, it may be like the Babylonian exile, where there are 3 returns. You know, we get 3 chances at coming back to it. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I hope you're willing to share some of your own thoughts, not just pose questions to me, although I'm more than happy to answer them, but offer your own thoughts on what has been, what is, and what is yet to come. You know, with apologies to sort of Charles Dickens on that one. Does that sound fair enough? If I get 3 nods, I'm happy. Oh, I've got at least 6. That's fantastic. All right, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen with you. How about this? If you like yellow, you're in for a treat. Okay, there we go. Can you see that? Nice and bright. Okay, so the title that well, I was going to say the title I was given. I chose the title. Is Mending the Nets, Preparing for Mission. Those are sort of twin imperatives. I put All Saints Timoth, Dawlish, Shildon, and Herne Bay. That's where I'm from. I'm currently the furthest east participant in tonight's gathering. I know there are people many thousands of miles to the west, and welcome. It's an absolute delight to be with you, really. But as I said, what I would like to talk about is, you know, just reflecting on our journey through Lent. Think about the past year and think about what's coming afterwards. Pope Francis said rather memorably that many Christians can be like Lent without Easter. And I'm in a Passionist parish. So my parish is run by the Passionist Fathers, and their principal charism is preaching Christ crucified. But as a group, I can think of very few people that manifest the joy of Easter better than them. So that Lent giving way to Easter, I think, is important to recall. And I want to talk about our identity as a church. Okay, embracing the invitation that Jesus himself gives to us. And I've got lots of lovely pictures. Okay, so these are questions that I want you to reflect on, and perhaps if you wouldn't mind adding your thoughts, your reflections in the chat, so that we can sort of pick up on them sort of later on when it comes to the sort of the so-called Q&A. But I'd like to sort of invite comment more than questions. So, how have you experienced the pandemic? What's been the most memorable description that you've heard of the pandemic? Have any sort of scriptural analogies come to mind? Or I'm sure that in the homilies that you've heard preached over the last few months, you'll have heard some descriptions of the pandemic like that. I, for one, have thought about it in different ways, and I've heard it talked about in different ways. Some people have seen this as, well, certainly the first few months as a novel experience. I think there's an increased jadedness, an increased tiredness. I've heard people talk about a sort of a low-level lingering anxiety that they're experiencing through pandemic. You know, where every decision that you have to make is, you know, contingent on following particular guidelines. You know, even going for a stroll down the street, having to change the side of the street in order to avoid oncoming pedestrians. You know, there's a low level, every decision, you know, things that we take for granted, we're thinking about more, which I think is tiring us. Regarding other descriptions of the pandemic, I've heard the pandemic described as the time in between the crucifixion and Easter. So I've heard the pandemic described as Holy Saturday, effectively. So that time in the tomb, that time of quiet, that time of emptiness, that time of not quite knowing what's going to happen. You know, thinking on those disciples on the road to Emmaus, thinking of those disciples gathered in the upper room. You know, the despondency, not yet knowing the joy that will come towards the end, despite Jesus's frequent reminders. You know, let's be honest, he was quite clear on what was going to happen. You know, we had that in Sunday's gospel, didn't we? You know, the cleansing of the temple, right at the beginning of his right at the beginning of John's account of the gospel, Jesus saying, you know, 3 days, build it up. So that Holy Saturday, time in the tomb. I've heard it described as isolation in terms, and in particular in connection to the story that we had a few weeks ago with regards to the lepers. So there've been many people shielding, many people isolating as a result of the pandemic under instruction by the community, in a way, by government, to stay back, to hide themselves away until it's, I suppose, safe to do so. Safe for them, yes, but also safe for others. Many people have been told to self-isolate by being, you know, close to somebody else. And it's curious that, you know, that story of sort of Jesus and the lepers, he tells tells those healed to go and present themselves to the priest for, you know, to say that they're pure enough to, you know, participate in the community's worship. You know, almost, you know, some analogy, I would suppose, to that sort of the wee sticker that you get when you've been vaccinated. You know, the wee card, you know, here's your permission to re-enter society. I've heard it described as the exile in Babylon. You know, when the Israelites were exiled from the promised land and, went into, were deported. And there was a separation from the things that they held particularly dear, a separation from the things that they held to be sacred and most important: the temple, the dirt under their feet, the soil, that deep connection they had. And they needed to find new ways of expressing their identity. And I suppose we've been doing that too during this time of pandemic, trying to find new ways of expressing who we are. The move to the wonderful sort of masses on Facebook Live, the Stations of the Cross that you're doing from the sitting room, the way that we're responding to other people's practical needs in terms of our charitable activity. The things that we've done before have had to change. And I suppose I'm inviting you to reflect, well, will they have to change again? And we've heard it described as Lent. This period in the wilderness, this period of aloneness, of dryness. Father Mark, in his letter announcing this series of talks, talked about most of the world appearing to have been in Lent for the last 12 months. Talked about the impoverishment of human encounter, of anxiety and depression. But equally, and I think quite rightly, in his letter, he talked about Lent as a time of preparation and hope, recognizing where we've been and where we are. And I'd like to extend that to where we might be. But given that I'm speaking to a parish and many people in Plymouth, and if you're in Vancouver, then you're on the coast too, and I'm speaking from a coastal town in North Kent, I'd like to offer another analogy. That is the boat. Bit trite, coast to coast. I'm going to talk about fishing boats, and why not? But if you do have any other ideas about how you've heard the pandemic described, please pop them in the chat. So the Babylonian exile, the tomb, the lepers, but what about this one? Actually, before we get into fishing boats, what about this one? Noah's Ark by Edward Hicks. It's a late mid-19th century painting. Do we all feel as though we've been sort of 2x2'd onto a boat, riding out the deluge? But this is what I wanted to talk about, really. I've felt something of this pandemic being an opportunity, really, and I've felt it quite strongly, that this pandemic is an opportunity to reflect on who we are, what we're doing, yes, but also to prepare for what comes next. Now, in this picture, we've got people cleaning the hull of a ship, the hull of a boat. You can see the white lines sort of across the middle, in between the planks. You've got people caulking the seams, so making it ready, making it slick, so the water passes smoothly under the hull, so it moves through the water unimpaired, efficiently, well. In this picture, we've got a pair of fishermen. I don't know if you can notice the nets tied to the tow to keep it taut. We've got the mending of nets. We've got the fixing of the tools of their trade. So at this time, neither the people who are caulking the boat nor the fishermen who are mending their nets are doing any fishing. And in some ways, I felt that this period of pandemic has been a period of enforced dry dock, as it were. An enforced time when the boats are pulled up onto the shore, pulled up onto the beach, where you're able to get to the bottom, where you're able to focus on the preparing to do better, what it is you really want to be doing. I don't know if this is hitting home at all. I hope so. So much of what we were doing was suspended almost immediately when the pandemic struck. It's almost, is it a year next week? Is that the anniversary? How are you celebrating it? Anyone? Glass of water? So much of what we were doing was almost instantaneously suspended. And I think the last few months have been an attempt to try and recapture some of what we were doing and perhaps do it in a slightly different way. For the brave among us, it's time of doing something brand new. I don't know how many of you were Zoom aficionados. I don't know how many of you saw it coming and bought shares. If you did, please, get in touch with me and tell me the next big thing. I'd heartily appreciate that. But this is a time of exploring how we do what we were previously doing, but also an opportunity to rethink and to do something fresh, to do something new.
I am such a fool for doing what I did.
Thank you.
Cool.
All right. Okay. So this image, which is a beautiful Caravaggio picture, is the calling of Peter and Andrew, or Simon and Andrew, I suppose. And it comes, if I may, I'm just going to read the scripture passage. Okay, just to give you something else to chew on rather than my random and disconnected thoughts. I'm going to give you something from scripture itself. So if you want to just focus on this passage and when it comes to your reflections and what you want to put in the chat, feel free to do so. So Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee. He saw two brothers. They were Simon, his other name was Peter, and Andrew, his brother. They were putting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for men." At once, they left their nets and followed him. Goes on to say that he invited two more fishermen. Goes on to say that he went and picked a really unlikely ragtag group of people to follow him. I don't know if you are willing to be categorized as a ragtag group of people that follow Jesus. Perhaps you are. I would certainly be more than content to be counted among a ragtag group, as long as they're following him rather than, I suppose, anyone else. They were ready immediately to answer the call. The call came from Jesus. They dropped their nets immediately and followed him. I mean, theologians and scripture scholars and exegetes have, pondered over why they were so quick to follow him. Was it boredom with the fishing? Was the fishing not particularly good? Although the vast majority seem to think it's something compelling about God calling you to do something special. And I dare say that's probably the one that I would pick. In a very real way, he is calling us to the same. You know this. I'm not giving you anything new. Just a simple and a humble reminder that that is what we're called to do. Are we ready when the call comes? Sorry, the bins are being put out. You might get a rumbling in the background. It's not thunder. So how are we ready? Have our boats been caulked? Have the seams been caulked? Have the nets been mended? How have we taken this time of pandemic to reevaluate what it is we're doing and how it is we do it? How are we using this period of Lent to do the same, personally, but also corporately as a group? Jesus told his disciples later on to put out into the deep. Duc in altum. Perhaps our first step will be, as the advert read for this series, paddling about in some new shallows. You may recognize those words from them up. But even then, perhaps we are being called to more in this Lent, in this pandemic. Perhaps, and I have no wish to sound pessimistic, only realistic, that perhaps the pandemic is stirring something in us to alert us to a trouble, to a tension that has been happening for a number of years. Perhaps the pandemic is a wake-up call to the slow drift away from the practice of faith of many of our brothers and sisters, who we would love to welcome back. Perhaps and I'm going to use a word that I'm using in shorthand, so please don't pull me up on it. That perhaps those that have drifted away through this period of COVID, period of coronavirus, the COVID lapse, to absenting themselves for good reason or out of habit. Perhaps it's alerting us to a reality that's been going on for a long time. And perhaps it's intention, or perhaps we might be intentional about stirring up within ourselves and within each other a desire to fetch them back, a desire to put out into the deep, a desire to call back. So, as I've said, in many ways, our preparation for Easter is similar to the preparation our communities need to. I put need to. I've been quite assertive, which those that know me know that's not quite my natural demeanour. Need to undertake for the post-pandemic future. My parish priest, I've apologised to him 6 times in the past week for being assertive. I said, I'm being very, very forthright, Father. I've also got a Father, Mark. We were talking in the Parish Pastoral Council only last week about what we do to encourage back those that have been unable to come. How do we make it safe? How do we make it easy? How do we be the invitational parish that we want to be? And it's worth reflecting on this. I'm sure you are reflecting on this. But equally, we need to reflect on our part of that. And also, is our vision for this big enough? This is a thought I shared with Father Mark at a meeting last week. Is our vision big enough? You know, one at a time, yes, but do we want to stop with one? Or do we want, what was the net filled with? Was it 153 fish? Someone with a slightly more sort of nuanced knowledge will be able to sort of put that in the chat. So what is the mission entrusted to us? How has the pandemic shone in sharp relief what it is that we have to do? How might I participate? How might you participate? How might we participate? And how might we prepare? You may recognise this absolutely stunning Rembrandt, the only seascape he ever painted. Don't look too closely at the chap at the bottom. I think he's been made rather unwell by the swell. Apparently the chap in the blue holding onto his pink cap is a self-portrait, so that's the artist. And here we have people grabbing at Jesus. Come on, stop this, stop this. And I had in my notes, I've got several pieces of paper scattered around the room. I came across one bit of paper that said Plymouth, Mark 4:41. So just before I came on Zoom, I picked it up, and the passage is from this. It's the calming of the sea. And they were filled with awe and said to one another, "Who is this that even the wind and sea obey him?" How much are we placing our trust in him through this pandemic? I would wager quite a lot. We've got, I don't know, 40 odd people on this call, 40 people who clearly love and honor Jesus. Otherwise, why would you be on a Zoom call with someone you've never heard of, speaking to you from a place that you've perhaps never been on a Monday night at the beginning of March? So I thank you again for coming, and I thank you again for your kind attention. But their love for Jesus was palpable. Ours is and must continue to be so. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So the government has offered us something of a roadmap out of this pandemic with various different stages. My lot went back to school for the most part today. 3 quarters have gone back to school. The other quarter is ensconced upstairs doing remote study, or emergency education, as I like to call it. But what is our roadmap? What do we expect when the pandemic ends? Are we willing to cast out? Are we willing to put out? Are we willing to trust? What do we expect? Here we have an image from Jacopo Bassano's Miraculous Draft of Fishes. So here we have 2 chaps, perhaps James and John, straining to bring in the haul of fish. Stunningly beautiful, colourful, energetic image. Very, very small boats. I don't know if we just flick back to the Rembrandt. I'd rather be fishing in that in a storm than one of them. Sort of strange canoe shapes. But what have we experienced in the past when we've been told to put out? What have we experienced in the past when we've been called to play our part in the mission of the church, to draw others to Jesus, to go and make disciples? Perhaps trepidation, perhaps fear, perhaps even rejection. Perhaps even starting with those nearest and dearest to us, we've found it challenging. Speaking to your brothers and sisters about coming to Mass. Ay caramba, perhaps at Christmas. Just want to reflect on that fear and that trepidation in the light of this. The disciples clearly in this image were not worried about fishing. They were clearly not worried about putting out their nets or casting a line into the sea. They were worried about survival. And perhaps that's how we've experienced these last 12 months. Mission can wait, because now we're just trying to get by. And I get that. I get that completely. My colleagues and I, we're ringing sort of all the parishes across Southwark at the moment. And we're getting a lot of, we are just trying to get through this. And all the while saying, completely understand that, Father. It's a tough time for communities, it's a tough time for families, but there is an opportunity when it comes to it, and preparing ourselves for that opportunity, I think, ought to be somewhere near the top of what we're thinking about. This time does feel like a storm is raging sometimes. Though outside, the storm's outside and our doors are shut, the sound of the storm sort of travels through news reports that we see on telly, like gaps, like wind whistling through the gaps in shuttered windows. I acknowledge there's a pervading sort of feeling of jadedness, fatigue, tiredness. Maybe I'm just talking for myself, but I suspect it's true of others too. That's nothing compared to the desolation that these chaps who saw what Jesus did felt at the time of his crucifixion. They didn't heed his messages like the one we heard last weekend, or perhaps they didn't understand. And yet the commission remained to them. The commission remains to us to go and make disciples. So where are we fishing now? It's another one from James Tissot at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Miraculous Draft of Fishes. I don't know if you can see all of the picture of their Zoom images covering it up. See how many people is required for pulling in a haul this size. Not just one person fishing, this is a group of people fishing together. Perhaps at this time, with Facebook, with individual conversations, with our own charitable actions, we're fishing with a spear as opposed to a net, perhaps one at a time. Perhaps the invitation of someone to join in a live stream. Perhaps the invitation of someone to join a talk like this. Perhaps an invitation for someone just to share a prayer over WhatsApp. To help people know, individually perhaps, as with a spear. It's a slightly twisted analogy, I suppose. That someone knows them, that someone loves them, that someone cares for them and wishes them to participate in the gift that we have gratefully received from our Lord. So maybe the time will come from a move from spear to net. Who have we got here? Johann George sort of Platzer, again, the miraculous catch of fish. And you see the amazement of the gathered crowds as they bring in this haul when other people's boats are empty. I don't know if you can see in the background there. So how are we preparing to fish? Are we mending our nets? Are we caulking our boats? I'm going to stay there. Okay. So this time of Lent, we all know the traditional Lenten promises, practices, and I am going to wind up now. But I was just thinking about what practical tools we have to fish. We know the commission. We know that we have a role in bringing others to Jesus. That's by virtue of our baptism. That's who we are. That's what we're called to do. It is clearly easier said than done. But this period of Lent is perhaps an opportunity to look at the traditional Lenten practices, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, to look at the encouragements you might well have received from the other speakers, the encouragements you've received from your priests, as not just simply encouragements to grow in holiness, but encouragements to grow and prepare for mission. Perhaps in some ways the mending of the sails, you see the sails in the background there, perhaps in some ways the mending of the sails might be our prayer, might be the ways in which we perhaps repair small tears in the sails so as to catch the Spirit. We need to expect that the wind will blow. We need to head in the directions where the Spirit will blow and wills. Perhaps before we go fishing, we need to build up our stores. We need to put in into a little box, perhaps a first aid kit, perhaps a couple of bars of Kendal mint cake, something I remember from my childhood. Perhaps we need to engage in scripture reading and spiritual reading in order to build up that store, that richness, that underpinning. Perhaps in caulking those seams on the hull to stop the water coming in, we can help our boat run true. And perhaps we can see the mending of the nets during this time of Lent as learning what will catch, what will draw others to Jesus. Perhaps we need to reflect on our baptismal promises, not just recite them as if it comes as a pleasant break from the creed on Easter Sunday, but reflect on those baptismal promises in the weeks leading up to Easter. Reflect on what you truly and really believe. Practice your story. Practice your part in our story. Pope Francis, the Directory for Catechesis, it all talks about the initial proclamation, the first proclamation, and how it needs to ring out again in our catechesis. The first proclamation, the kerygma, the kernel, the heart of our faith, needs to ring out again in our parishes and our homes. We need to be reminded of this very best of news. Just in brief, this kerygma, this good news, practicing it, learning it, practicing it, repeating it, saying it, is in some ways like mending those nets, tying up those nets. It is this message that has garnered people for Jesus over the centuries and will continue to do so, we so believe. A river has been created by our sin. Catherine of Siena speaks about this so eloquently. But that river has been bridged by Jesus. That river can't be crossed by our own power. That river has been crossed by Jesus as a bridge. And it's up to us to decide to cross it and to help others do so.